Hello and welcome to the second episode of the CDI Talks. My name is Anton Shekhovtsov. I'm the director of the Center for Democratic Integrity, an NGO based in Austria. And my guest today is a leading French foreign policy analyst, Nicolas Tenzer. He's an academic writer and guest professor at Sciences Po Paris. He's also the founding president of Paris-based independent think tank, the Center for Study and Research for Political Decision. He's the editor of Le Banquet and author of many books on the future of Europe and international relations. Thank you very much, Nicolas, for agreeing to talk to me today.
My pleasure, Anton. Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, I think the event of the recent days is the summit between the U.S. President Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin. What's your impression from this summit? Because I think we waited for this summit for several weeks. Since Biden invited Putin for this summit. What's your impression?
Well, first of all, I have to emphasize on the fact that basically, if some people could have said that this summit was a success, it will be very bad news. In fact, no one would expect any success of this kind of summit. Because, Putin has a still strong position in Europe. I mean that he has seized part of Donbass, 20% of Georgian territory, illegally annexed Crimea, killed in Syria more Syrian civilians than even ISIS, and has a very strong footprint also right now in Africa, in countries such as Mali, but also Central Africa, etc. So basically, I think that for the moment, basically, Putin was able to set the agenda. And there was absolutely no adequate response, neither from the US nor for Europe. And in fact, this summit is a kind of U-turn, if you wish, of the US stance on Russia, because President Biden, who you remember called Putin a killer, which was literally true, in fact say, well, we have to basically to stop Russian aggressions, to stop Russia's meddling, in democratic countries' policies, US and European countries also. And basically, there are some things that are not acceptable. We have to put red lines, even if we could be very cautious about the word red lines. You remember Obama, I know that sometimes it could be completely meaningless. But still, I think Biden understands the very nature of Putin's regime. He's not fooled by Russian propaganda, and that's good. But still, of course, there are no concrete results of the summit. No one could expect there could be some concrete results. And basically, the outcome of the summit, if any, will be seen in the next coming years, or let's so expect months. And we will see what the US, alongside the EU allies, will do. I think that's the main point. It's probably a little bit too early to draw the conclusion of the summit right now.
You see, when Biden was talking at a press conference right after the summit, he was talking mostly to American journalists, and he kept on saying that he was there at the summit in order to protect American national interests. So on the one hand, he might be seen as a voice of the collective West talking to Putin, but at the same time, he made this remark that he was defending American national interests. Do you think, or what are takeaways for Europe from this summit? Do you think that Europe benefited from this summit? What's your opinion?
No, basically, I think Europe doesn't benefit from the summit, but I wouldn't say also that it was something bad for Europe. Also, I think basically it seems to be completely neutral. That's why I said that the result will be measured in the coming months or years. Because, of course, Biden knows that he has to attract also the US voters. To reverse the tide, you see in comparison with what Trump did. You remember the disastrous Helsinki summit between Trump and Putin. And he has also to say to the American people that he is protecting US people interests. That's why he was insisting on the cyber attacks on some US facilities or networks, etc. And it was very important to reassure the public, the American public, that must be aware that the kind of meddlings that we were witnessing in 2016, but also 2020 election, in fact, won't be allowed again. That's why he was insisting on the red line. Having said that, of course, he was not very eloquent, I would say, on Europe. But he was, not necessarily with Putin, but he was, during the NATO summit, certainly. And if you see the final communique of NATO, it was very tough on Russia, very clear. Russia was named and shamed about 60 times, which is a lot, more than China and other country. It was depicted rightly as a threat, and the major immediate threat to Europe, US, and democracies as such. And that was very important. But of course, unfortunately, Biden cannot say, probably it was not able, and maybe a decision has not been taken yet, on what very concretely the US administration will do when it comes to Ukraine, and especially Crimea, but also Donbass, of course, Belarus, that is in the kind of zone of influence of Russia, that is, as Antony Blinken pointed it out just a few weeks ago, not acceptable. We have not to recognize, to acknowledge the existence of zones of influence in Europe. And we will see also what Putin will do. And in this, I am a little bit less optimistic, I would say, also on Syria and Africa. Concretely right now, and it could be a source of concern. I won't, of course, conceal that, certainly, that we still don't know what's the action plan, and if there is any action plan from the US. Because basically, you see, the idea of strategic stability that President Biden was emphasizing on probably is not good, because the true question is that if we consider the world right now, and especially Europe, we cannot accept to have a stability from now. I mean, basically containment, as I recently pointed out in a piece for Politico, is not acceptable, because containment will be, okay, we still accept and we give a legitimacy in a way to what Putin already did in Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, etc. And that's not acceptable. I think that time is to come for a kind of rollback. I mean, basically, Putin must abandon his grip on Ukraine, on Crimea, must not have a say on the future of Belarus. That must be decided freely by the Belarusian people through a sincere, recognized internationally and monitored internationally vote. And must not continue to support the criminal against humanity, Bashar al-Assad regime, in Syria. And I think that's really what we in Europe, but I think the US people, but also the Syrian people, and many people also in Africa, Middle East, etc., and all the people who are standing for democracy, we must know that what will we do to, in a way, to set the agenda again, because that's what I was saying, that basically from now on, Putin had set the agenda. It's not acceptable. The democracies must have an action plan.
I think it is a great point that you made in that article for Political Europe about that containment is essentially like fixing what Putin had achieved before. But at the same time, what I see with this summit is that it's somehow, every new American presidential administration wants to reset relations with Russia. It has almost become like a ritual for American politics. I don't want to be overtly pessimistic, but it's they all begin with this sort of a reset. Then sometimes passes, they become disappointed, and we know how it starts and we know how it ends. It always ends the same way. But with the summit, don't you feel that it was almost like by inviting Putin to the summit, it looked like everything was forgiven in a way for Putin. So he was still invited to the table of the talks. So is it, don't you feel that it is Putin who benefited the most from this summit?
Well, I would say that personally, I was certainly not comfortable with the idea of a summit. If I were President Biden, I am not, as you know, certainly I wouldn't have invited Putin to this kind of summit, which is completely, in my view, meaningless. And it's true that if we consider, for instance, all the propaganda outlet from the Kremlin, they are saying, you see, there is a new kind of direct talks between President Biden and Putin. And so there is a kind of legitimacy given to Putin as the head of a great power, which is not. If we consider, the GDP of Russia, which is the equivalent of Spain's, basically Russia is not a great power, but still it has the capacity, of course, of very maleficent deeds or influence, and from this point of view, was certainly bad. Of course, any kind of reset, but Biden doesn't use, of course, the idea or the word reset. Any kind of reset will be completely fool's game and will play into Putin's hand. And personally, that's also something that I said also when President Macron met several times Putin. It's not acceptable that we laugh with Putin, we smile with Putin. Basically, Putin is not only a killer, as Biden said, but also a war criminal. And I think if the concept which is determined by international law is taken seriously, we have to acknowledge that the right place of President Putin is in The Hague. Not in a meeting room in Geneva with President Biden or any great powers or democratic leader. Still, having said that, we will see what happens next. If, of course, you have more talks, I'm not talking about the question of New START treaty, which is something I think that we have to consider apart. But that could be also, again, for in terms of security for the US and Europe too. But if we still have on other talks, and if there is illusion that we can deal with Putin, that we could negotiate with Putin, that will be certainly ominous, I think.
And yet, despite what you say, it looks like Europe has almost, for example, forgiven all those killings that have been done on the European soil. And the most recent example, I think, of inadequate reaction on the part of European leaders is when the Czech Republic, when they found out that Russia was behind the attacks on the ammunition in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, and they asked all the NATO member states to expel at least one diplomat or one Russian spy or officer working for the embassies. And too few countries decided to show solidarity with the Czech Republic, despite the fact that almost all countries of the EU and NATO show solidarity with Britain after the attempt at Skripal's life. What do you think of these? Have those killings were indeed forgiven?
I don't think they are forgiven, and still I am not sure that to expel the Russian diplomat is, I wouldn't say a good way, but enough, I think, in terms of reaction. I think certainly we have to expel more in most of the European countries, because we know that those alleged what those alleged Russian diplomats are for. Certainly we have to do that for our own security. But I think to say, okay, we expel diplomats, that's all, that's a punishment, etc. Okay, let's go like this, and it's enough? Certainly not. I think that the true issue right now, after all those killings in European soils, you were talking about the ammunition depot in Rebrice, but we can talk also about the Skripals. So before you had Litvinenko, you have also some Chechens also murdered, in Berlin and some other places, etc. I think the most important way to react, even if there are some legal issues behind, is to adopt not only Magnitsky law type sanctions, but strong punishments against Putin's inner circles. It means the oligarch. And there was a list released by Vladimir Ashokov, the head of Navalny's anti-corruption foundations, with 35 names. And I think we have really to implement those measures, to enforce them. And that's, I think, the key way to counteract and basically to hurt Russia. Certainly we have to do that. I think that the US is ready. Let's see what happens. You have also an anti-corruption and anti-kleptocracy caucus in the Congress right now, with Representative Malinowski, former ambassador for human rights in the US during Obama's administrations. And I think that's very important for the EU to act also accordingly. I was saying that there were some legal issues, because you may have some Russian companies or Belarusian companies, or let's say Chinese companies, or other countries, because Russia is not the only one that we have, of course, to punish this way. I mean, basically to prohibit, all the travels of those people to Europe, to the UK, to the US, but also to seize their assets. Either, real estate or also accounts, banking accounts. But that those people could sue also the EU for that. And so we have to be very cautious, and to develop legal tools. Having said that, that's complex, but that's feasible. It will take certain time, certainly, to have the adequate laws, to pass the laws, to enact the law. Everything must be legally perfect. But still, what we are witnessing right now, and that's a deep source of concern, is there is absolutely no unity of the EU on this. Just see, the behavior of Germany with not only Nord Stream 2, but also some other companies. Let's say the behavior of some Austrian banks. Let's consider also the way that other countries, including my country, France, also has some trade deals with Russia in some sectors, especially energy. I think that's certainly not good, and there is absolutely no unity. And we could talk about other issues like the golden passports given by Cyprus and Malta, etc. I think we must go serious. And unfortunately, we are not serious. We have the Baltic states certainly want to do more, the Czech, we have certainly Poland, also some Nordic countries, such as Sweden, for instance. But still, there is not enough resolve. That's why I am rather pessimistic, unfortunately, on that.
I think it was very important to emphasize that these sanctions about these 35 people from Putin's inner circle, that they are targeting the Russian elites, people who are close to Putin, and it's not really about punishing the entire country. And I think this is a very important distinction between Putin's regime and Russia as a country. And in this appeal that we recently signed, countering hybrid threats, 10 steps for a resilient Europe, I think this human dimension was quite highlighted in this appeal, where it said that we need to talk to Russian people. We need to not only talk to the Russian leadership, but also to Russian people, if only to show that the West is not waging a war against Russian people.
Absolutely, that's the right point. And I think that quite often people like us are depicted by the Russian propaganda as Russophobic. In fact, we are not. I think I feel in myself a kind of Russophilia. I mean, I like the Russian people, and I think that basically we have to acknowledge that that Putin is creating Russian people's misfortune. He is hurting Russia. Is the enemy of Russia, if we consider the long-term interest of the Russian people. I think that's a real key point, and I think we have certainly to bridge the gap between the EU, the UK, the US, and those Russian people. We have to support them. We have certainly to give more help, more support to the free Russian media. There are not a lot, and even there are less and less, given the quite totalitarian footprint of Putin, on Russia. But we have to stand with them. We have exactly the same way we have to stand with the Belarusian opposition, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and others, with the Belarusian free media, and with also some trade unions. And I think we have to compensate the losses of the workers who decided to go on strike, for instance. That's a very concrete thing. And of course, to welcome, for instance, Belarusians and Russian students in our universities. I think we have to show this kind of solidarity, especially as we know, let's come back to Russia, especially that 48% of the young Russian people, I think under 25 or under 28, have one aim, one yearning, which is to leave Russia, because they don't see any kind of future in Russia, not because only of the regime, but because what of the regime is doing, on the economy, which is a disaster. The social conditions of Russian are a pure disaster also. You have more than 10, or I think it's 12 million people in Russia living under the poverty line, for instance. The state of the hospitals and medical facilities in Russia that are really hurt directly by the COVID-19 pandemic very seriously, and still right now I think it's a full mess. And I think that we have certainly to acknowledge, because Putin is devoting a lot of money to propaganda, to its wars. A lot are going to the pockets of the oligarchs, because basically, as Catherine Belton pointed it out, in her book, they are completely dominating the Russian economy with very strong inequalities that we don't have in any democratic countries, for instance, in terms of capturing the wealth of the country. And we have to do that for the sake of Russian people.
It is a very good point about the social inequalities. I will get back to this later. Well, you said you're not very optimistic about the resolve of the EU in dealing with Russia, but maybe you've heard that recently the European Commission has presented a new strategy towards Russia. It's called on EU-Russia relations: push back, constrain, and engage. So now you have these three elements. It's not just containment, as we discussed, but it's also push back and constrain, which I think is a step forward in dealing with Russia seriously, or taking Russian threat to European democracy seriously.
Well, I will say we are still in the middle of the way. Because there is still one word I am not very comfortable with, which is engage. What does it mean, engage? What does it mean? I'm not talking about Russia, but about Putin's regime. I think it is completely meaningless, in fact. And certainly you have this document. It means that conceptually, I think most of the European leaders and also the EU High Representative are taking Russian threat very seriously. Yes, certainly, but that's a piece of paper. And so I have exactly the same questions that I have for the meeting between President Biden and Putin. What's the action plan, actually? And in this document, I don't see a very concrete action plan. We were talking about, the sanctions against oligarchs. We could talk about also giving more military support to Ukraine, given more also support to the Belarusian oppositions, to get rid of the illusions that we could obtain anything from the UN Security Council because of the vetoes from Russia and China on Syria. So what the EU will do, and many people are talking about your EU strategic autonomy or EU power, what we call in French Europe puissance, Europe as a power. But in fact, if we are not able to act, even I would say if the US is not following us as they did, in fact they didn't, in Syria in 2013 after chemical attacks, in Ghouta. So all those words are words. And I think it's not good that probably Europe will continue to express its very deep concern, etc., to blame Russia, to say that Russia has to take into account the EU's demand and that Russia has to abide by the international law and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And that's good. Okay. In terms of good consciousness, we have. But to have a good consciousness without taking action, let's see, even in the final NATO communique, they said, okay, we still have the open door policy as decided in the Bucharest summit in 2008 vis-a-vis Georgia and Ukraine. Okay, but no, where is the map? And I think that's quite important to if we consider that we have to give access and priority access to Ukraine and Georgia to NATO. We have also to certainly, I think, not for right now, because I think it's too early for obvious reasons, corruptions, and Georgia also political stability, etc., that we know. But still, I think we must give clear indications about the date if Georgia and Ukraine comply with all the recommendations, and even for the EU, I mean, especially for Ukraine, I am sure that Ukraine won't be member of the EU before, I don't know, 2035, or because, the state of the corruption there is just, and the independence of the judiciary make it right now completely impossible. But still, I think we have to give a pass. And we've give this concrete pass, and we are still trying in a way to, let's say, not to hurt Russia. It will be absolutely no way. It will be a kind of dead end. I mean, we don't need communique. We don't need in a way a statement. We don't need a document. I think that's not useful right now. What we need is basically action.
But at least you see, a couple of years ago, we were not even talking about these documents. Not only about the actions, not only about the documents, but still. So for me, it's still a step forward. I know the EU is very, very slow, but at least now we have this acknowledgement of the problem, and this is how the solution of the problem starts. But now I want to go back to your country. I remember when we met last year in Paris. We were talking about how President Macron is following some sort of pragmatic approach in dealing with Russia. But at the same time, in September, if you remember, it was France that insisted on imposing the sanctions related to Navalny's poisoning. Is something changing in Paris? Is something changing in Macron's office in relation to Russia?
Well, it's certainly difficult to say, but I think what we can first of all state is that, in fact, when it comes to sanctions, especially, Macron has, at least still he's in power, I'm not talking before, very strong on sanctions. And he never proposed to abandon the sanctions. And especially, as you rightly said, after Navalny's poisoning, he became more aware of the necessity to counter Russia. I think there are some elements that open his eyes. First of all, that was related by the French newspaper Le Monde. Putin and Macron had a talk after Navalny's poisoning. And in this talk, Putin was saying, no, it's not us, it could be the Poles, could be, I don't know, the Mossad, or also any kind of things, complete blunder. And he was saying that directly to Macron. And Macron really didn't appreciate, because Putin was taking him as an idiot. He is not. And that was, I think, the first time. So basically, no, Macron better understood that there could be absolutely no trust given to Putin. And so you remember the idea that Macron was launching of a new architecture of security and trust. That were the words. In fact, that's completely dead end. I will say that any attempt or idea of a kind of re-engagement or reset with Putin's Russia, if I may say so, brain dead. You see, and I think that's probably something quite new. Still, Macron considers that he has to talk with Putin. And you see, with the summit between Biden and Putin, probably it could be a kind of encouragement for Macron, which probably is not good, to talk again with Putin. But it certainly leads nowhere. And probably you remember what the French Minister of Defense, Florence Parly, said, I think it was around about 9 months ago, saying, well, we discussed with Russia, but with absolutely no results. No result on Ukraine, no result on Syria, no result on the cyber attacks, etc. And I think that France still is in between. For instance, you'd still have a kind of cultural cooperations, you could have still some meeting, etc., which is certainly not good. And there is still an illusion. Also, you can hear some of the leaders. I'm not talking about Macron, because I think that Macron has abandoned this idea that we have to consider the long history of Russia. Well, remember Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, or Mussorgsky, or Chekhov, or Tolstoy, or Dostoevsky. I don't know. Well, there is a kind of romanticism in some French circles. I am not talking about, the Putin's trolls or people booed by Putin. A kind of romanticism about Russia, which is, in my view, very, very dangerous. And you have also a lot of soft propaganda. We know perfectly, and you better know even, the hard propaganda. You have all the people from the far right standing with Putin, praising Putin, etc. But you have also some mainstream leaders or mainstream journalists, etc., saying, well, maybe the stance on humiliation is not completely untrue, that probably we behaved badly vis-a-vis Russia. We don't basically understand Russia. We have to understand Russia, etc. You have all this kind of music, I will say, which is unfortunately very familiar to my ears, going around in France, which is also dangerous, because then we are considering Putin's Russia as a normal country, and it's not a normal country. And we are not paying attention to the war crimes against that he has committed since 21 years. The start of all that was, never forget it, Second Chechnya War. And it was a kind of template in terms of atrocity, war crimes, of what Putin did more than 10 years after, since 2015 in Syria. And I think we should have paid more attention to what he did at that time. Only there was one people, the late André Glucksmann, the philosopher, who was trying to raise awareness about what happened in Chechnya. But then it was a silence.
Talking about France and President Macron, as you say, his position is somewhat ambivalent towards Russia. But do you think that the Kremlin will try somehow to undermine Macron in the presidential elections next year? And do you think, for example, that giving this new position for François Fillon is the Kremlin's way to reach out to conservatives, maybe to try to support them? I mean, the Republicans. What's your take on this?
Well, first of all, we had interference, already in 2017 election in France, as you know, with what we call the Macron leaks, that we know. We certainly know also how Russian propaganda channel, through YouTube, Facebook, Telegram channels, or even VKontakte channel, are trying to influence the Yellow Vest movement. Certainly, they did not create the Yellow Vest movement, for instance, in France, but they were certainly putting oil on the fire. That's absolutely certain, and we have some evidence of it. That's very important. Now we have, of course, the support of Putin to Marine Le Pen since a very long time, far-right leaders. You have Mariani, is a candidate for the regional election in the south of France, etc. That we perfectly know. But you're perfectly right on pointing out that you have a major part of the Republicans who are in favor of Putin. Most of them wouldn't say we like Putin, but there is a kind of narrative or a kind of rhetoric saying, okay, we don't like Mr. Putin, but we had exactly the same rhetoric on Assad. We don't like that. Yes, he's a criminal. Assad. Okay, we know that. But in the names of, let's say, Christian values, the praise of the strong man, the kind of, we need Putin to fight against terrorism, which is a complete blunder, etc. You still have this kind of narrative among the Republicans, and there are many mainstream Republicans, in fact. You have them in the Senate, you have them in the National Assembly, in the party, obviously, who are not standing against Russia. And that is something that I said to many of the Republicans, including MPs whom I know, saying, okay, you are very strong on China. You are blaming China for the crimes of genocide, in Xinjiang. I mean, all the crackdown on Uyghurs, etc. Okay, that's good. But you have to say the same on Russia. Oh, it's more complicated with Russia, etc., etc. You still have, this kind of stance, which is very dangerous. I think that's not the question of Mr. Fillon. Mr. Fillon is a Mr. Nobody, basically. Never forget that he was sentenced to 5 years in prisons, including 2 years firm. Of course, that was the third judgment. There will be an appeal right now, so the decision is not, completely made by the justice, but still, you still have that. And you know also that Mr. Sarkozy also is very close to Mr. Putin. That he had made some business that was also released by Le Monde with an insurance Russian company. He was talking in Russian sovereign fund assembly, etc. And you have many others. And I think it's very dangerous. And I think that we have basically to focus not only on the far right, which we still must, of course, but we have to focus on the mainstream leaders from the right, the conservative, the Republicans in France, but also part of the left, not only the radical left, Mélenchon and others, but also part of the left is still hesitating to have a very strong stance against Putin because of the influence or the effect of the soft propaganda that I was talking about.
But with the left, not only with the far left, but also with the mainstream left or the center left parties, again, this question of social inequality in Russia, this is shocking, because Russia is one of the most socially unequal countries in the world, and still some of the pockets of the left, not only in France, of course, but also in Spain, in Greece, in Portugal, they see Russia as a fighter against global capitalism, which is ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous.
Yes, and against imperialism, as they said, because many people, in the left, and that was true also for the Labour, in the UK. That's the true for the SPD, in Germany, and not only the Linke but also SPD. And you still have not most of the socialists, but part of the socialists still are hesitating. Basically, it's supposed to be anti-imperialist, and the foe basically that they have in mind is the US, not Russia, which is incredibly stupid. And also you have, in fact, what also is very important, for instance, when we are considering all those people in the far right or conservative and others who are praising Putin's Russia, endorsing Putin regime, is that most of the electorate in France do not care. Mm-hmm. But they do not care about foreign policy. And especially if you see, for instance, if you say, for instance, to the voters of, let's say, Mariani, for instance, in the south of France, okay, but pay attention to the fact that this guy is supporting Putin and Bashar al-Assad, etc. People do not care. And themselves, all the far right and conservative voters, they are considering Putin as a man who is, well, a strong man, courageous, as we say, in slang, who has balls, and that's the image for some of the conservative voters, and you have a very important, in France, anti-US sentiment,
which is almost as a traditional for France.
Not only because of Trump, not only we could understand because of Trump. Okay, that's good. Yeah. But still against US because what it is, and then they will say, okay, you are talking about Ukraine, Crimea, Syria, but do not forget Vietnam, do not forget the war in Iraq and Abu Ghraib jail, do not forget about also Afghanistan, and then you ask the story about what the NRA did in Europe, okay, and you see that's the danger. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very difficult, in the mentality of the opinion to reverse the course.
It is very difficult indeed, because some of these narratives that you mentioned, they have history. They did not just appear out of the blue. They have roots in the political culture of France and other European societies. In conclusion, I want to ask you whether you think that the Kremlin will try to support Le Pen again in the elections next year. What's your opinion?
Well, they will certainly support Le Pen, obviously. They may support also, not contradictory, the Republican candidate. Of course, depending of who he or she is. But they could try to do that, certainly. They will try also to fuel a kind of unrest in France. You may have social movement, you may have again the surge of yellow vest movement or a kind of yellow vest movement, which is very good. And through this theme, basically Putin's Russia is catching two birds with one stone. On the one hand, they are just trying to show to the conservative electorate that there is a kind of merry mess in France. You have unrest, you have upheavals, you have riots, France is afraid, and you need a strong leader, which of course could be Mrs. Le Pen. And on the other hand, they are also trying to catch the leftist voters, saying, okay, we are siding with the voters, we are siding with the low classes of the society. We are against Macron with a capitalist. You remember we worked for Rothschild, and the name Rothschild, you understand what it means, in the eyes of some people. Not talking also only about the kind of anti-Semitic allusion, of course. And so I think it's very dangerous. And I think that's why we have really, and the thing that I said to many people in the government in France, we have to take some very strong measures. First of all, we must not accept that this kind of propaganda is released through some channels. We certainly have to take radical measures to close this kind of channels. I think we have the freedom of expression. Everyone can express its view against the government. Of course, that's democracy. But when it's fueled by Russian propaganda, or could be Chinese propaganda, or I don't know, other propaganda, you have also from Turkey, on other issues. But I think it's not acceptable. First of all, and second, we have also, I think, to take very radical anti-SLAPP measures. SLAPPs, you know what it is, that's strategic lawsuits against public participation. It means intimidations by either big companies or some foreign powers trying to intimidate journalists, investigative journalists especially, and to also try to intimidate also the people, think tankers, researchers, scholars, people from the society, just to disclose what those states is doing. And I think it's very important to protect those people. Thirdly, we have to expose, it's not necessarily illegal, all the people who are working with foreign powers, notably Russia, not only Russia also. I think it's quite important because you have some politicians who allegedly have received some, let's say, compensation from a Russian company or Russian government indirectly, of course, trying to lobby for this kind of states. You have some think tanks, you have maybe some journalists, etc. And I think there must be more transparency and there must be coordinated efforts. That's also what we're saying, in the 10 measures released in Globsec just 2 days ago. We have certainly to better coordinate, not only with the EU allies and the US, but also to have a better coordination within the main department in France. I mean, domestic and foreign intelligence, the tax services, the customs services, and all the people who can investigate. I think that's very important. What happened publicly to Mr. Fillon is just the top of the iceberg. And I think it's important to know it. I think basically we have really to do more. And I think that the government, President Macron and others, must be aware of that. And that's not only a question of, the success of the failure of Macron in the presidential elections. It's basically a question of highest security interest. We have to get very serious about that. And I must say that during 5 years, we were not.
I hope, Nicolas, that your voice, your very important voice, will be heard in France and especially among the people in the government and around the government, the policy advisors. And I thank you very much for this conversation, for sharing your insights into international relations and politics in France. And I hope our audience enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. And make sure that you subscribe to our channel to receive notifications when we upload new episodes of the CDI Talks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anton, for receiving me. Thank you so much.